Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel, and today I'm going to be counting down the 10 greatest rock and metal band replacements of all time. Kicking off the list here with number 10, I'm going to go with Phil Anselmo, replacing Terry Glaze in Pantera in 1988. And, when you look at the early Pantera catalog in the early to mid-80s, they took on a predominantly hair and glam metal sound and adopted that look as well to better fit in with the hair and glam scene at the time that was dominating metal. But those early albums really aren't all that memorable, fronted by Terry Glaze, who I think was a fine frontman, but really nothing remarkable about him or his style of singing that really made those albums memorable, in my opinion. I don't own them. I really have no desire to. I haven't listened to them in a while, so there's always the chance they'll grow on me over time, but definitely not a string of albums that I'm too tied to or connected to. Don't really enjoy the early Pantera albums, but the group took a huge step forward in 1988 when they recruited Phil Anselmo to replace Terry Glaze as lead vocalist, and they put out power metal, which, it's not classic Pantera, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. And then in 1990, still fronted by Phil Anselmo, they would release this monstrous album here, Cowboys from Hell, which helped to cement Pantera as one of the premier metal bands of the 90s, and it's also one of the pioneering albums of the groove metal genre. So Pantera definitely making their mark here in 1990 with Cowboys from Hell. And when I look at the Pantera catalog, I really focus on the core catalog there from 1990 to 2000, which is where I feel the band did their best work, fronted by Phil Anselmo. And, when you compare Terry Glaze to Phil Anselmo, I highly doubt that Terry Glaze would have had the imposing look, the crazy vocals, the great aggressive delivery of his vocals as well that Phil Anselmo brought to the table as the vocalist for Pantera. So I highly doubt that Terry Glaze would have done a sufficient job with the band going into the 90s. Without Phil Anselmo, there's a chance that the talents of Pantera would have gone under the radar. So coming in at number 10 here, I'm going to go with Phil Anselmo replacing Terry Glaze in Pantera. For my number 9, I'm going to go with Ian Gillan and Roger Glover, replacing Rod Evans and Nick Simper in Deep Purple. And, the Mark I lineup of Deep Purple is fine for what it is. It's the band in their formative years, and the 3 albums they recorded with Rod Evans on lead vocals are fine, but really nothing remarkable about them, similarly to what I was talking about with Terry Glaze on lead vocals for Pantera. It's, the early years of Deep Purple here, and there's really nothing too amazing to come off those 3 albums they recorded with Rod Evans, but that all changed in 1970 when they recruited Ian Gillan and Roger Glover to join the band. Roger Glover, an incredible bassist, and Ian Gillan, one of the all-time best heavy metal vocalists, and they released this album here from 1970, this Deep Purple in Rock, which is one of my all-time favorite albums, definitely in my opinion the best Deep Purple album ever made, a genre-defining album as well, one that would definitely help pave the way for heavy metal in the future. There's a classic album here, and it was apparent very early that the Mark II lineup of the band was going to be the most successful of all of the band's iterations over the years, and it would yield some of their best albums, in my opinion. Ian Gillan, like I said, such a tremendous vocalist, and Roger Glover did bring so much to the band in their rhythm section as bassist. So, in my opinion, I much more prefer the Mark II lineup to any other lineup of the band. I think it's great stuff, and I think Deep Purple and Rock is definitely a step in the right direction for Deep Purple when they were really coming to their own. And the Mark II lineup began with a bang here as Roger Glover and Ian Gillan replaced Rod Evans and Nick Simper in the band. Following that up with my number 8, I'm going to go with Ronnie Wood, replaces Mick Taylor in the Rolling Stones. And, after Mick Taylor departed the Rolling Stones in 1974, he left a big void. Who was going to replace Mick Taylor in the band? Well, the right man for the job was Ronnie Wood from the band Faces, who toured with the group as an unofficial member throughout 1975 before officially joining in December of that year when the Faces broke up. And Ronnie Wood, like I said, the right man for the job, and has proven to be one of the best classic rock bassists of all time, having performed on a number of fantastic classic Rolling Stones records, as well as being one of the most enduring members of the band, still in the group to this day. So coming in at number 8 here, I'm going to go with Ronnie Wood, replacing Mick Taylor in the Rolling Stones, officially in 1975, in December of that year, but he was touring with the group all throughout that year as an unofficial member as well. Even though Rob Halford has become synonymous over the years with being the lead vocalist and frontman for heavy metal legends Judas Priest, the original frontman for the band was a man by the name of Al Atkins, a founding member of the group who eventually departed the band, citing financial reasons, and was replaced by vocalist for the band Hiroshima, Rob Halford. And, even though the super early Judas Priest stuff with Al Atkins does have its merit to it, it's got some promise. Obviously, the best work in the Judas Priest catalog comes from Rob Halford on lead vocals fronting the band, and honestly, I could not imagine Judas Priest reaching the same heights without the ear-piercing vocals of the metal god himself, Rob Halford. So, coming in at number 7 here on the list, I'm going to go with Rob Halford, replacing Al Atkins as the frontman and lead vocalist for Judas Priest. In the same vein as Pete Best and Chad Channing, you have to feel bad for Doug Sandom, who was asked to leave The Who in 1964 due to his age, and he was replaced by Keith Moon. And, while Doug missed out on the success of The Who, you have to question whether or not they would have reached the same level of success with Doug in the band, because Keith Moon, one of the most impressive and enigmatic drummers of all time, one of the best in a live setting as well, definitely one of the greatest classic rock drummers of all time, brought so much mystique to the Who and their overall sound, their overall appearance. So you do have to wonder whether or not they would have reached the same success with Doug Sandom in the band without Keith Keith Moon, but his unique style of drums over the years definitely did personify the band's sound, so you do have to feel bad for Doug Sandom, who was left out. But overall, Keith Moon went on to be one of the all-time best, like I said, and definitely was a great fit for the eccentric UK rock of The Who. So coming in at number 6 here, I'm going to go with Keith Moon, replacing Doug Sandom in The Who here in 1964, and going on to become one of the best classic rock drummers of all time. Moving on now into the top 5, and coming in at number 5 here on the list, I'm going to go with Cliff Burton, replacing Rod McGovney in Metallica. And, before Metallica were the biggest metal band in the world, they started out in Lars Ulrich's basement, playing their favorite new wave of British heavy metal songs together, and the bassist at the time was Rod McGovney, who would soon be replaced by Cliff Burton after the guys saw him performing live at a nightclub and were absolutely blown away by his skills on the bass. And recruiting Cliff Burton for the band, in my opinion, is the smartest decision Metallica ever made, because Cliff brought with him a wealth of knowledge of other genres of music, be it jazz or blues or classical music as well, that really helped to broaden Metallica's scope. And Cliff was a huge part of what made those early Metallica albums so great. I think some of Cliff Burton's shining moments on those early Metallica records include great instrumentals, such as Anesthesia Pulling Teeth, and Orion, Call of Cthulhu as well. In addition, the bass intro on For Whom the Bell Tolls is one of the most iconic intros of all time. Cliff Burton, like I said, definitely the smartest decision the band ever made was including him in the band, recruiting him for the group in the early 80s, and unfortunately for Rod McGovney, he missed out on a ton of success in the band, but who's to say they would have reached the same success without Cliff, really helping them along the way in those early years. So coming in at number 5 here, breaking into the top 5, I'm going to go with Cliff Burton, replacing Rod McGovney in the group in Metallica's early years. It's hard to imagine anybody else playing drums for Rush, but before Neil Peart cemented himself as one of the greatest drummers of all time, on Rush's debut album, John Rutsey plays drums, and even though he does a fine job, obviously nobody can hold a candle up to Neil Peart's drumming ability. And I think that Neil Peart joining the band and the band replacing John Rutsey was one of the best decisions they ever made. Neil Peart, like I said, would go on to become one of the greatest drummers of all time and really help to cement Rush as one of the best classic rock groups in rock and roll. So I think definitely one of those beneficial decisions they ever made was replacing John Rutsey with Neil Peart, my number 4 here on the list. Top 3 now, and coming in at number 3, I'm going to go with Ronnie James Dio, replacing Ozzy Osbourne in Black Sabbath. And obviously Black Sabbath, one of the most important metal bands of the 70s, releasing a string of incredible albums in the 70s, all the way up to Sabotage, and you know what, I would even throw Technical Ecstasy in there as well. Great album, but by 1979, they were burnt out creatively, and they released this album here, Never Say Die, which is one of my least favorites in their catalog. Really an album I never listened to anymore, but it was clear that something had to change because they were creatively burnt out. Ozzy Osbourne's behavior became more erratic and unpredictable as his drug habits worsened over the years. So in 1979, they fired Ozzy Osbourne and replaced him with former Rainbow vocalist Ronnie James Dio. And in 1980, they released this great album here, Heaven and Hell. And what makes this one of the best band replacements of all time is the fact that Ronnie James Dio joining the band really allowed Black Sabbath to have a creative rebirth, and really revitalize themselves with a different style of playing, different sound, different lyrics, different frontman, totally different everything. And I think the band was definitely refreshed by the change here. And of course, Ronnie James Dio, everything he touched turned to gold. Like I've said before on the channel, Ronnie James Dio had the Midas touch, and he did incredible work with Black Sabbath. It's a shame that this lineup did not last all that long, right? Egos would collide between Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler with Ronnie James Dio, but I think the albums they did make together are incredible, and it all started here with Heaven and Hell in 1980. So I think definitely one of the best band replacements of all time. Cracking the top 3 here has got to be Ronnie James Dio replacing Ozzy Osbourne, and something tells me Ozzy Osbourne did alright for himself outside of Sabbath as well. Very rarely does a band do career-defining work with one vocalist, lose that vocalist, recruit another one, and do some more career-defining work. That's exactly what ACDC did. For my number 2 here on the list, Brian Johnson replacing Bon Scott after Bon Scott's passing in 1980. Bon's final album was Highway to Hell, one of my all-time favorite rock albums, and they recruited Geordie vocalist Brian Johnson to replace him following his death at a time when the band were at a crossroads. They weren't sure whether they should continue the band or discontinue totally, but obviously they decided to continue with Brian Johnson, and they released this perfect album here, Back in Black. It's what made them international superstars, and I've said it before on the channel. It's one of my all-time favorite records, right? This is the album that got me into AC/DC, and even though I'm more of a Bon Scott guy than a Brian Johnson guy, I think both eras of the band are fantastic and almost perfect, right? AC/DC, one of the best classic rock bands in history, and they did great work with Bon Scott and Brian Johnson here, so I think definitely one of the best replacements in classic rock has to be Brian Johnson joining the group following Bon Scott's death, my number 2 here on the list. Before I get to my number 1, there are a few honorable mentions here that I want to give out. So some special recognition goes out to Will Duvall, replacing Lane Staley in Alice in Chains years after his death when the band decided to start up once again. Sammy Hagar, replacing David Lee Roth in Van Halen. I've talked about it before on the channel. I prefer the Van Hagar stuff to the David Lee Roth era, even though both eras are great and iconic. Jason Newsted replacing Cliff Burton in Metallica following Cliff's death in 1986. Jason Newsted just brought a different energy to Metallica's live shows that made him one of the best replacements in rock and metal. Ringo Starr replacing Pete Best in the Beatles, and you gotta feel bad for Pete Best, but I think Ringo Starr was definitely the right choice for the band. And then in the same vein, Dave Grohl replacing Chad Channing in Nirvana, and once again, I feel bad for Chad Channing, but the biggest difference from Bleach to Nevermind in Nirvana's sound was Dave Grohl's drumming, and even though I'm not a big Nirvana fan, I absolutely respect Dave Grohl as a drummer. I think he was a fantastic drummer in Nirvana, and he's a great frontman for the Foo Fighters as well, so those are my 5 honorable mentions, and they're all great band replacements that yielded incredible success for the groups, but I can only fit 10 on the list here today. And finally, coming in at number 1 here, the greatest rock and metal band replacement of all time has got to go out to Iron Maiden, replacing Paul Di'Anno with Bruce Dickinson in 1982 to release Number of the Beast. And, I enjoy the Paul Di'Anno era a lot. It really mixes a lot of progressive and punk elements, which are two of Steve Harris and Paul Di'Anno's influences, respectively. So I think they do a great job in that sense, and I really do enjoy the early albums. It's made in their Jurassic period, as Bruce Dickinson describes it, and, there's some great stuff on both of those Paul Di'Anno albums, but the best work Maiden did was with Bruce Dickinson in the 80s, in my opinion, and Number of the Beast is such a classic album that really introduced us to Bruce Dickinson if you were unfamiliar with his work, and Samson, and, just looking at the tracks on here, Invaders, Children of the Damned, The Prisoner, 22 Acacia Avenue, The Number of the Beast, Run to the Hills, Hallowed Be Thy Name, the greatest metal song ever made, really gave the perfect introduction to Bruce Dickinson and the classic Maiden era there, and they would go on to release a string of incredible albums with Dickinson throughout the 80s, and even now, I enjoy the current era of Maiden, with Dickinson still at the helm, still an incredible frontman, still great live, an incredible vocalist as well, so I think definitely the best decision Maiden ever made was replacing Paul Di'Anno with Bruce Dickinson. A much better and more reliable frontman, in my opinion, was Dickinson, who replaced Di'Anno in 1982 when they released Number of the Beast. So that concludes my list of 10 greatest band replacements in rock and metal history, which should be visible right over here. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, turn on the bell for notifications to be notified of a new upload, and let me know down in the comments below, what are some of your favorite band replacements in rock and metal? Let me know all that good stuff down in the comments. I'd be very interested in hearing what you guys have to say. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.